and I hope that's okay with everybody. So I very great pleasure to introduce Alysha Shivji and Rafaela Rodriguez from the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network. Before I hand over to them, I'd like to just do a quick introduction for those of you who maybe don't know Thirst, because there's lovely to see lots of new people here. Lovely to see lots of old friends here as well. And sorry, I'm being interrupted by a call. I will just share my screen and share with you a few slides, if that's okay. Yeah. About this. So the Thirst is the International Roundtable for Sustainable Tea. I'm going to, and we are a UK-based organisation. We've been in existence for about 6 years, and we are an organisation. Our aim is to help facilitate the creation of a resilient tea industry that's fair for everybody within it. If I sound a bit staggered in the way I speak, it's because people are constantly joining, so I'm trying to let them in at the same time. As I said, our vision is of a resilient tea industry that's fair for all. And we aim to achieve this through knowledge sharing, as we're doing now, through convening civil society and industry stakeholders, and through catalyzing change through advocacy and consultancy. And just to give a few examples of our knowledge sharing, we have a knowledge hub with over 100 resources on it that we're constantly adding to. And if anybody knows of resources or has resources that you'd like to add, we're very grateful to have those. They're all on environmental and human rights issues within the tea sector. We also publish a monthly news update, a roundup of news from around the world on human rights issues for tea workers and farmers and environmental issues. And we also run roundtables and webinars like this and on topical issues. But a very big piece of work that we're working on at the moment is a human rights impact assessment of the global tea sector, which is quite unusual in that it's not a human rights impact assessment that's been commissioned by a single company. It's an independent study, although some companies have contributed financially towards it, as well as other organizations, donor organizations. It's funded by multiple sources, but is an independent study. And we're in the third year of that 3-year study, and there's some very interesting results of that, which Alysha has also worked on that study with us. And so I'd invite you to visit our website to find out the results of that study and to follow it. So let me stop there. That is about Thirst. And now, as I said, it's my pleasure to introduce Alysha Shivji, a research professor at Monterey Tech, the business school there, who has done a lot of work in studying worker-driven social responsibility, which, as many of you may know, started in the tomato sector in the USA, and she has also done a lot of work with Thirst on the root causes of human rights breaches in the tea sector. And so we're really, really thrilled that she's now going to bring together those two areas of expertise to discuss how worker-driven social responsibility could benefit the tea industry. And then she will also, we'll be inviting Rafaela Rodriguez, Director of Strategic Partnerships at the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network, who's very kindly agreed to join us today to share her views and knowledge and expertise on that topic. So over to you, Alysha. Would you like me to share my screen?
Yeah, could you share the slides, please? Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. So excited for this webinar. It's been like, a dream of 5 years of things I'm really passionate and care a lot about. Coming into one webinar with other people who are interested in the topic is really a dream come true, and getting the chance to speak with Rafaela Rodriguez, who has this amazing firsthand experience of working with the model is, feel very lucky and happy you all are here. Next slide, please, Shobita. So today, I thought what we do is first give a bit of background of how, why we're asking this question, and then move on to, I will present some findings. This is an interesting webinar because it's different than webinars I've participated in before. I will talk a bit about findings from a paper, but I'm not presenting a paper. We're not presenting a program. We're really asking a question that we've been thinking about, that clearly other people have been thinking about because there's so much interest. And it's really, so it's a different approach to a webinar. We really want it to be more of a dialogue conversation starter. And we do want to hear, your questions and thoughts, but while we're presenting, just write your thoughts or questions in the chat, and then we'll collect them to guide the discussion at the end. So like I said, I'll present a bit of the findings from my research with the Fair Food Program, focusing on remedy, which is an aspect of the model, but not the entirety. Then Rafaela will take over and give a bit of a higher overview of different parts of the model, and focus in on a few that we thought were particularly relevant to this sector. Then we'll switch gears to talk about the tea sector. And I want to make it clear here that, we are not experts on tea. I'm very passionate about tea, and I've had the opportunity to get to work with Shobita and Thirst on this human rights impact assessment, but we don't have the experience or knowledge that probably people attending this webinar have, and that's why we're holding this space to get to work with and learn from your guys' knowledge and experience. Then we'll move on to talk about worker-driven social responsibility and tea. What are some of the barriers? What are challenges? What might it look like? And again, this is where, we want to hear your guys' input. And so we'll tell you what we've been thinking about, but really to open it up to hear what you guys are thinking about. And then I think the part that we're most excited for is the Q&A and discussion, where we can, hear what you guys think. Stay here. So first, some background. Let's go back 5 years ago, starting my PhD in the Business and Human Rights Center at the Alliance Manchester Business School. I decide I want to research remedy. Remedy is maybe less sexy than other parts of business and human rights, because when you talk about remedy, you're admitting wrong, right? And the wrong is there, but people like to talk about it less. But I thought this is really important. And I know some of you, probably most of you, are very familiar with remedy. But just in case, for those of you who aren't familiar, in the context of business and human rights, remedy refers to when a human rights abuse occurs, rights holders have access to remedy through the state or through the non-state. And so I focused on non-state remedy. And remedy refers to both the procedures to report complaints, like grievance mechanisms or audits, as well as the substantial outcome of those mechanisms. And so I was looking at both those aspects in the context of non-state remedy. Originally, I wanted to do multiple case studies to compare different approaches to remedy. The Fair Food Program was going to be my first case, looking at remedy within their worker-driven social responsibility model. And I wanted my next case to be with thirst, to look at approaches to remedy in the tea sector. And I was still working on my third, but as often happens in PhDs and research in general, I didn't do 3 cases. I did 1 case with the Fair Food Program. COVID, logistical constraints, but honestly, I have so much amazing, rich data from my case with the Fair Food Program that I had more than enough to write write a PhD, and I'm still talking about it today. And I was also lucky enough to work as a research consultant for Thirst on their human rights impact assessment while I was doing my PhD. And I should say the case with the Fair Food Program was for my PhD, but it was also to support the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights' Accountability and Remedy Project. And I should say that I did that fieldwork at the end of my first year of my PhD. And for those of you who work in the field or study in the field of business and human rights, it's incredibly depressing and disheartening a lot of the time. And so I had spent this whole year learning about these programs and organizations that I thought that I knew, that I, thought were the answer. If everyone just did this, followed this program, followed this, then we would be fine. But when you read critical research into those programs, they're not evil programs, but they certainly don't do what you thought that they did. And they certainly aren't the answer for everything in the way that I truly hoped they were. And so when I went to do my fieldwork with the Fair Food Program, I felt so excited. I had known about the program since I was a kid. I grew up in Florida. But I was incredibly skeptical, and I was really ready to have my heart broken. And so I do this fieldwork, and I am so pleasantly surprised to have my skepticism proved wrong. Remedy in this model, it works, and it didn't, it's been a process, and that is something that's important. But, I went to audits, I went to education sessions, I spoke to former workers, I spoke to growers, I spoke to supervisors, and they were being remediated, and things were working, and they were involved in their remediation in a way that I didn't think was really possible. And I was blown away, and I was like, I have to tell everyone has to know this model works. It works here. I think it can work other places. Maybe this is like what I've been looking for. And so I was thinking, after I came back, I was analyzing findings, and I was thinking about all the different places it could work. But I was really thinking a lot about tea, because I was also doing this research with Shivji. And there are so many similarities. There are clearly differences, but there are also a lot of similarities between the plantations in Florida that were established, where the plantations in India were established. In these times of colonialism and capitalism, you have forced labor, migrant labor, dehumanization of workers, this concentrated market power. I'm like, I think this is it. This can save the tea sector. But like, how? What do you do with that? What's even the first step? And I think for me, at least, 5 years later, this webinar with you guys thinking about this question is kind of maybe the first step. So I'm really, really excited to be here. Next slide, please, Shivji. So let me tell you guys a little bit about the research with the case. This idea of rights holder-driven remedy is what I call remedy within the Fair Food Program's worker-driven social responsibility model. And I wrote a paper about it, and the big finding, right, is that, rights holder participation, worker participation is key through all stages of remedy. And this idea of, stakeholder dialogue or worker voice is now it's in the narrative, right? People are saying it more, people understand that it's important, but often it doesn't really change much, right? It's kind of treated as this tick box exercise. People are like, yeah, we have stakeholder engagement. Yeah, worker voice, we prioritize it. But the workers don't really have input. Their remedy doesn't really change. And so in this paper, I asked the question, okay, well, what are necessary conditions for rights holder remedy, for this worker voice, to be effective in providing effective remedy for workers? And what I found after analyzing data were there were 2 big umbrella ideas: education and enforcement. And once again, these are often treated like tick boxes, like, yeah, we have education, or yeah, well, enforcement less so. People don't really like to talk about enforcement, but education, right, it can't just be a tick box. It needs to be ongoing and thorough, not just this one-off thing. It also needs to be about both rights and remedy. Because if a worker learns all their rights, but they don't learn what to do when those rights are abused, like what's the point? It's like learning all the ingredients to a recipe, but not learning how to make the recipe. It's, kind of useless. And in the Fair Food Program, their approach to education is based on lived experience. It's worker driven, right? They do these worker driven education sessions, which are so powerful for workers because the workers, they understand what their peers are saying. They speak the same language. They've been in the same place. They use the same dialect or lingo kind of words for things. And they trust them. These are their peers. So they're getting education that they can understand and trust. And so it's effective education. And then enforcement, this one people like to talk about less, but I'll say it now, worker-driven approaches will only work if there is enforcement. This part is so important. And this goes back to, so rights holders have to be able to participate without fear of retaliation. And that's so important because in Florida agriculture, in dairy, in tea, these places where worker-driven social responsibility programs are, there's a historic culture of retaliation. If a worker reports, speaks up, says anything, they will be retaliated against. And that leads to a culture of silence. And a remedial system, it can't work in a culture of silence. It only works because people use it. And so the enforcement is able to chip away at this culture of retaliation. And this is important that this is part of the process, right? So you can't make one of these programs and expect it to just change everything and work right away. I think that's hard for us in the world. We want things to, we design this thing, we want it to work right away. And that's not how it happens. It's a process, right? People aren't just gonna immediately trust like, oh, I'm protected now. No, it takes time. It takes time for workers, they call it pasa la voz, like they speak to each other about when things work. They do public apologies for when a supervisor retaliates so that workers can see like, oh, this person retaliated and now they're being punished, and they're being punished because people used remedial mechanisms and reported it. And so slowly, you get rid of, or at least lessen, the culture of silence so the remedial system can work. Next slide, please, Shobita. And one of the other findings in this case is that remedy is often thought of as like as a single mechanism. And it really needs to be thought of as a system of mechanisms working together. Not like think, oh, I'll design a better grievance mechanism, or I'll drive or design a more effective audit. And those things are important, but they can't be thought of like alone. They need to be seen as this system that works together. In the Fair Food Program, they called it an enrichment cycle of information, with the mechanisms informing one another and reinforcing one another. And I think that's really important and often missing in the way that we think about and talk about remedy. And importantly, education is in the center of the umbrella because none of the other mechanisms will work if workers aren't educated about their rights and remedy. And also importantly, they're all under this umbrella of enforcement. Because if there isn't enforcement, workers aren't protected, and then we have a culture of silence, and they're not going to use the mechanisms, so it's not going to work. And this approach to remedy is one very important component of the worker-driven social responsibility model, but it's not the only component. So now I'm going to switch over to Rafaela, who's going to tell us a bit more about the model. And if you want, Shobita can go to the next slide.
Yeah, the next slide is great. Thank you, Alysha and Shivji, for having me. Oh, one before. Yeah. Yes, there we go. And as Shivji said, I work for the WSR network. And I think it's important also to mention that before working for the network, where my role is to work with worker organizations who are thinking about this model, who are trying to figure out like, how does this work within my community? How does this work within the sector that we work in, within the space that we work in? Is that, Southern US, which is quite conservative, or is it another place in the US or the world where the politics are important to understand before trying to figure out how WSR would work? Before working for the network, I was also an auditor. I think Alysha sort of mentioned this, for the Milk with Dignity Standards Council, which is the enforcement auditing body for the Milk with Dignity program, which is based in Vermont and covers New York as well. And it monitors dairy farms and farm workers within those dairy farms. And currently, that was a program started by Migrant Justice. And the company that has signed that legally binding agreement that I'm going to talk about as one of the key elements is currently Ben & Jerry's, for all of those who eat ice cream. So, I mean, Alysha, I think you covered a lot of those critical elements. I will say time and time again, and for those who I've spoken with, or if you go to our website and peruse through some of the resources we have, we talk about the WSR elements as needing to work together, right? There is not like a pick and choose model of, okay, we'll just really focus on education and have the best education for workers. That'll really solve the issues with current CSR initiatives. Or we will really focus on auditing and make our auditing better. You can focus on those, and improving those is always better, but WSR really is an entire component, an entire system that works because of all those items, and none of those are negotiable. Alysha mentioned enforcement. I will just talk about a few other pieces of WSR that are key. When we say worker-driven, what does that mean? That means that who is designing the program? Workers. Who is writing the standards, or what we call the code of conduct? Workers. Who is leading the implementation and enforcement? Workers. And how do workers lead these different pieces? So when we talk about education, right, it's a worker-to-worker education. And what does that build? Trust. So it's workers who have been in the fields, tomato fields, or who have been dairy workers, who have been folks that pick tea, that say, here are your rights. You are part of this program. Now you know that you're part of this program. These are your rights, but also this is the way that you can call and be your own monitor of your own rights. Call that support line and say, hey, I'm not sure that this is happening where I work, right? There's something wrong with housing. I'm not getting paid what this program says I'm getting paid, etc. And that key piece that Alysha mentioned of retaliation, you can tell a worker, nothing's going to happen to you if you call that line, if you make that complaint. But workers and you know, most of these industries include undocumented workers or immigrant workers or women, right? Vulnerable communities. And so the way to really hone in or take that like message home is that a worker, somebody's going to have to try it, right? They're going to trust that education. Maybe they're going to call, maybe it'll be an anonymous call, but what's really going to make sure that workers and spreading that word about protection from retaliation is results. What happens when a worker called about sexual harassment? What happens when a worker called about not getting paid the wages that they're owed? And the program has a mechanism where the results or the remediation of that call is swift. It's quickly. That worker will see the results. And that is one of the issues we highlight in some of the systems that currently exist in the government to protect workers, right? A worker can call DOL, OSHA, and say, hey, there's a health and safety issue. Hey, I did not get paid for the wages. But the amount of time it takes for a worker to go from calling that government agency to seeing the results, it's unfortunately really delayed because of, you know, lack of staff, et cetera. And so within this program, workers are able to see, oh my God, Alysha called, she got her wages back within a week. Maybe we can trust the system. Maybe we can continue calling. And this is one kind of anecdote or a phrase I always, or a story I always try to say is, you know, if you have a support line and no one calls your support line, it doesn't mean there aren't abuses, right? It's like a suicide hotline. If people aren't calling that hotline, it does not mean that people aren't in need of that service. It means that people do not trust that service to actually help them. And so the more calls you have, in my opinion, at the beginning of one of these programs, the better it's working. That means that folks are trusting that, hey, I'm going to be vulnerable. I'm going to call and I'm going to trust that I can raise this concern. Another key piece that I wanted to talk about is the legally binding. What do we mean when we say legally binding agreements? Which is an important and critical piece. The legally binding agreements within the WSR model are agreements between brands and that worker organization. So for example, Migrant Justice and Ben & Jerry's. For example, the CIW and Whole Foods, the CIW and McDonald's. And those legally binding agreements commit that company to say, I will use my power in the market to enforce market consequences for those employers or suppliers who are not in good standing within the WSR program. I also want to highlight that in good standing is different than like violating the code. I think a lot of times there's a misunderstanding that within a WSR program, an employer who is not in compliance with the code will be kicked out of the program. Yes, a supplier can be kicked out of a program, can be suspended, but it is very specific about when that happens. What we want to do within a WSR program is get those employers to comply with the code, right? So for example, when I was first auditing dairy farms, the first year of the program, we weren't just trying to kick out employers from the program, but rather say, how do we come up with timelines that work for you, that work for workers, to get you into compliance with the code? So it's a collaborative process of figuring out what timelines work for everyone involved. And with the exception, and I know Alysha is going to talk about zero tolerance violations. There's not a timeline for somebody who sexually harassed you. That is not acceptable. But there could be a timeline for raising wages. Let's see, I'm looking at here to see if I missed anything. There are the auditing. It's a yearly audit that happens on all farms where workers and managers are interviewed. There's also that support line, right? So we're making workers the advocates of their rights. They can pick up the phone. They can talk to auditors in person about conditions. There's the legally binding. Oh, the premium. I did want to highlight that because in the analysis that the CIW made, and I think Migrant Justice made as well in the industry, dairy, for example, has very low profit margins. And so Migrant Justice, the worker organization of dairy workers, did that an analysis of who has power and who has money in the supply chain. And the answer was the companies. Like the farmers themselves weren't getting rich off of dairy. And so there is a price premium, right, that Ben & Jerry's pays to the farms to offset the cost of compliance. Because we've also realized that asking a farmer to raise wages, asking a farmer to improve housing conditions without that money support is pretty impossible, right? You're just gonna like run those small farms out of business. And so Ben & Jerry's recognized, right, the power they have, the money they had to invest in their supply chain and to give that money to farmers so that they could comply with the human rights and protection of those workers within that supply chain. I think I'll leave it there. I mean, we'll have an entire conversation and discussion, and I'm happy to answer questions, whether it's with my, WSR network hat or with my auditing past Milk with Dignity hat. But yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rafaela. So excited to have you here in this discussion. Shobita, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, so now we're gonna switch gears a bit to look at tea. And like I said, I like tea a lot. I've done a lot of research, but not a tea expert. So I'm sure you all know other issues, but these are ones that we've been thinking about right now. And so during the discussion, feel free to prove us wrong or add your own. But so low wages. poor working conditions, child labor, gender discrimination, temporary migrant labor, and lack of worker voice. And these are issues that were in Florida, that were and are in Florida agriculture, in the dairy industry, in all the places where worker-driven social responsibility programs are currently expanding, also have these sorts of issues. Next slide, please, Shabita. Some challenges that we've thought of are, geography and sector fragmentation. Now, we should say, in our, dream future where we start a WSR program, it's not going to be a global program, right? You start small, you start focused to learn lessons. How does this work before you expand? Lack of worker voice. We know there are unions in the tea industry, and we also know that they're not always representative of tea workers. I also know about worker organizations in the tea industry that are. In fact, Pembla Orma, the women's tea worker organization in Kerala, reading the story about those women was actually one of the first connections I made mentally to the Fair Food Program and the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, because they have a really similar narrative, similar struggle, and similar approach to resistance. Complex supply chains. This was one I used to get a lot of pushback on at the beginning when I'd be presenting my research and say that, how can we expand this? They'd say, oh, well, yes, this works in Florida tomatoes because the supply chain is so straightforward. But now, it's expanded to dairy industry. The supply chain is much less straightforward, to fishing, to apparel, and those have much more complicated supply chains. So certainly the model has to adapt and approaches have to adapt, but I think it is possible. Rafaela spoke a bit about this, low profit margins and severe inequality of value distribution along the supply chain. It's true in dairy. It was also true in the Fair Food Program. They would tell me, before the program, workers would ask their employers to pay them, a bit more. Their wages were stagnant for so long. And their growers would say, well, we can't pay you more because the brands are paying us less and less. And this is why, one of the principles which Rafaela talked about of the model is buyers must afford suppliers the financial incentive and capacity to comply. And I think this is so important and missing from so many other responsibility programs that seemingly pass on the burden to their suppliers of like, you have to do this and this and this without having any sort of partnership or collaboration with their partners. So the model really acts as like a framework to build relationships and collaborations between suppliers and their buyers. What do you need to be able to provide shade to your workers, to be able to pay your workers slightly more? And that's really one of the, I think, shining points of the model. Informal work, this is also true. In Florida tomatoes, most workers were hired by their crew leader, not by their employer. But one of the standards of the Fair Food Program is that all workers have to be on the payroll of the grower. And the reason for this, according to the auditors, is that before, when the workers had to depend on the crew leader for everything, including their paychecks, they were left very, very vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. And so now some of that power, unchecked power, has been taken away from the crew leader. Lack of government regulation, true in tea, true in all these industries. The number of labor inspectorates for Florida agriculture is I think it's less than 5. It's so low. And, agriculture workers in Florida aren't protected under the National Fair Labor Standards Act. And so this is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons these programs need to exist. Next slide, please, Shavita. This is just a diagram to show you, you guys know how complex the tea supply chain is. And trying to figure out where along the chain this intervention needs to take place is certainly part of what should come out of these conversations. Next slide, please. Some benefits we thought of, I'm sure there are more. Improvement in worker agency and voice. So many workers and former workers I spoke to would say things like, well, we finally have a seat at the table when decisions are being made about things that affect our lives. And there's increased accountability and transparency. It's not just standards, not just laws that aren't enforced, workers are able to hold their employers, hold the brands accountable. And there's increased transparency, which results in reduced human rights abuses and greater empowerment of marginalized groups. Next slide, please. And what would WSR look like in T? We don't know. And this is really where we want, collaboration and input, but thinking about things so far, education, obviously a huge piece, education for both workers and management about both rights and remedy, binding agreements between the worker organizations and the brands, and independent monitoring. This looks different in different programs, who's being monitored, who's doing the monitoring, but an important piece is they're independent, right? So the people being monitored cannot be the ones who are majorly funding the monitors. There's just, and that's the way it works a lot of the time, but there's just too many conflicts of interest for that to ever be actually effective. And market incentives, this is the piece we were speaking about of, buyers supporting suppliers to be able to comply and giving those suppliers access to these buyers because they comply. Yes, next slide, please. And then these are some questions to guide the discussion about, challenges or opportunities or adaptations, what it would look like. But really, we want to hear your guys' questions, your thoughts. Thank you so much for joining us in this conversation thought experiment. Rafaela, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Alysha. Yes, sorry, Rafaela, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just didn't click the unmute button.
Yeah.
I did want to, I can start off with answering Charity's question in the chat, which was, how do you create the capacity, time, and resources for workers to have this level of involvement in the system? Are the workers engaged in the monitoring, enforcement, responding to hotlines compensated for this work, or are these primarily former workers who have been hired by the program? Great question. So in terms of, I mentioned many different pieces where the workers are involved. I talked about the design, and that including, most importantly, that code of conduct, those standards. The way that I've seen this in practice is that there is often a worker organization that is centering, they want to implement this within their community. So worker organization means that they are probably a nonprofit, right? That there are workers working within that organization that are former workers who have, for example, done surveys within the community to kind of gather, like, what are the violations happening? What are the patterns within the industry? Doing a lot of base building while they go to the community and ask these questions. That's what happened, for example, with migrant justice in Vermont. They went out, the organizers went out into the field and said, okay, what is, if you could improve anything in the workplace, what would it be? Gathering all of that and then translating that into a legal wording for a code. So that's the involvement of workers there. So there's two levels, right? Former workers that are organizers that are going out into the community, gathering this information. And then there is the voices of the workers that are getting input by this gathering of information. And they have, they have monthly asambleas, they call monthly meetings, where the workers were deeply involved in figuring out, what are we asking for? What do we want to ask the industry for in terms of protecting their rights at work? So that's in the design. When we're talking about monitoring and being like the leaders of the monitoring, we're talking about the ability, and this is why the retaliation piece is really critical, is the ability of workers to pick up that phone and advocate for themselves. They are not rewarded for, picking up that phone. That is just, I think, part of empowering workers to say, you can advocate for your rights and there is an entire system that will back you up. when talking about remediation, in practice, auditors involve the worker or workers who are involved in the grievance to figure out what is an appropriate solution for that violation. Some of them are really straightforward, like if the code says the workers have to be making state minimum wage, there's not a lot of play around what that state minimum wage is. But if we're talking about, for example, workers wanting a day off or paid vacation, which are some of the rights under the Milk with Dignity program, then there is a conversation to be had, right? Like, okay, farmer, how do we make this work? Workers, like okay, it is April now. Can we do this in June? Would it work for July? Can we stagger it? And that is where the workers' involvement takes place. There is not a monetary compensation for being engaged in the grievance mechanism. There is a like participation bonus. It's like the Milk with Dignity bonus or the penny per pound in the Fair Food program. Both of those are like monetary compensations that go directly to the workers, but it is not tied to their involvement necessarily. They could call 20 times or they could call 0 times, and their bonus is going to be in their paycheck regardless. I think I answered that piece of the worker involvement in the design and the enforcement. But yeah, I hope that answered your question, Charity.
Thank you, Rafaela. That was, yes, I think you answered it very comprehensively. Wilbert, you had a question.
Yeah, thank you so much, Alysha and Rafaela. It's such a pleasure meeting you this way, and listening to your experiences. Extremely informative and illuminating also, and inspiring. Alysha, you give a new meaning to the word enthusiasm, I think, and that's just marvelous because I'm sure you needed plenty of it to keep going. Yeah, as you say, in this world where there's so many stories where things didn't pan out as we had liked. As to how this could work in the tea sector, I mean, I'm trying to think this through. Like, I'm not as much a tea sector specialist as some other people probably on this call. I'm more of a generalist with some, experience over the years and interaction with people that know much more than I do. But what I know of the tea sectors, particularly in India and also Sri Lanka, is that they're determined by very well-developed industrial relation systems. Industrial relation systems that, according to some, don't work as they should, but they're very mature industrial relation systems with well-established, relatively powerful actors, counterparts that have also often political clout, and that cannot be ignored or excluded from a process like this, where you want to increase worker voice and worker participation, basically. And so, for instance, if you would want to, identify an NGO, for instance, in the Assam tea sector that could give voice to workers or mediate the voice from workers into this system, then I don't think that is realistic if that is not giving a central role to the trade union one way or another, because simply put, employers would worry that they would get into an industrial dispute if they would make such arrangements with an NGO or another organization that is not part of the larger trade union. So that is probably a challenge also, because unions, as I understand, are operating mostly at a sectoral level in a collective bargaining process, and the engagement of unions is not always that strong with their grassroots members in the workplaces. So how do you then mobilize basically workers in the companies. We also were struggling with that question a couple of years ago when we reviewed our tea standard. We came up with this concept that we had already introduced in our textile standard. We have a small textile standard that affects a few companies, not many. It's a compliance committee with, it's not rocket science, representatives of workers, worker leaders, basically the workers that already are on existing workplace committees, doing work on particular themes like health and safety, like gender, like the premium committee and the trade union committees could come together a couple of times a year to discuss compliance and results of audits and so on, talk to management about what they consider to be salient and priorities and so on and so forth. And then throughout the year, between audits, they could work with management and discuss improvements, so to say. They could also present an annual report to General Assembly of Workers, so to involve always the larger workforce and stay in touch with the larger workforce. And the trade union would always be invited to be on such a compliance committee. So that's the theory, right? And then we would require also a training for members of the compliance committee and hand-holding and all that support so that they could be equipped to do that work. That is interesting model. We introduced in 2021 our tea standard. It should be up and running in most of the fair trade certified plantations right now, but we also get a lot of feedback from employers that say, this is too much work for us. This is creating an administrative burden on top of everything else the fair trade demands from us. We think this is basically excessive. We've also consulted on this model for our general hired labor standard already last year. And most of the companies that we work with say, this goes too far. We don't want yet another workplace committee. Please find a more efficient solution, so to say. So these are some of the dilemmas that we struggle with. And I indeed wonder how we could then translate this very interesting, important concept into a tea sector that very much depends on its industrial relations system. Thank you.
Thank you, Wilbert.
Do you want to start and then I can go, or Savita? I don't know.
Yeah, thanks, Rafaela. I just wanted to say if people could introduce themselves when they're asking questions. So, Wilbert, do you want to just quickly?
Oh, I apologize for just jumping in like that. That was not very civil of me. I work for Fair Trade International at the Secretariat in Bonn, and I'm working on workers' rights.
Thanks, Wilbert. Yeah, and Rafaela, yes, please do respond. But I also wanted to invite anybody else on this call who maybe is within the tea sector who also has a view on what any of the speakers so far have said.
Yeah, I can answer, and then if anyone has anything to say, and also Rafaela. And I think, yeah, that point is definitely one of the things that makes it so tricky about the tea industry, because the unions are really powerful and they're really strong. And even like that Pamela Orama case of the women, they were protesting against not only their employers, but also the union for not like representing the women workers. The tea unions, as I understand them, in like India and Sri Lanka, are mostly male dominated. The tea pluckers are mostly women. But they, like you said, they have this political power. How can you like make a worker voice movement without? And so I think, yeah, I certainly don't have the answer, but thinking about how to involve the union as you have, kind of work through, or at least make them feel like they're being acknowledged, like you're not working behind their backs, but really not take that much input, because like you said, the grassroots workers are not really representative by these unions, but certainly going behind their back is not going to work for anyone. And then the point about the companies feeling that it's too much work for them, I think also this is where putting some responsibility on the buyers of those growers is such an important piece, where it's not just everything pushed onto the supplier having to do all this stuff, but involving the people who are also buying the tea to make them also play a part, rather than just like adding seemingly more work for the suppliers and kind of just letting those at the very top just continue like floating along without doing anything. I think, Rafaela, do you have any other thoughts?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, Wilbert, thank you for your thoughts, and just kind of break down the misconception that WSR is a model that doesn't work with unions. I think it is actually a model that unions have taken up as an alternative way of enforcing their rights with companies. I think somebody mentioned it in the chat. And yeah, so like the WSR programs in the garment industry have been led by worker unions in the garment sector who have wanted these type of programs. I think the reason why, for example, the Fair Food Program and the Milk with Dignity program are led by worker organizations versus unions is the lack of protection within the government structure for farm workers to organize in the United States. So it's like very hyper specific to this country. I think there is then the nuances that I think Alysha was talking about, and what unions represent who, and are these unions representative of the workers that would be mostly benefiting and protected by a WSR program. I think there are a lot of ways to make that work. I'm, currently actively working with our partners at Setul in Minneapolis, who are organizing construction workers. And as probably some of you know, unions in construction are very strong in the US. However, Setul, this worker organization, has partnered with those unions and said, yes, okay, you unions cover these sectors, right? And that is amazing. However, there are these other sort of missing pieces where workers are kind of not protected at all. So let's create a WSR program for those pieces. And so I think there are multiple levels, right? There are unions that say we need this anyways. There are unions that say, okay, we protect workers in this way, you protect workers in this way, let's work together. And there are places where unions don't exist within that community and within that sector because of political reasons or other reasons. And so I think it's always interesting, and that's why my work excites me, to work with workers and say, okay, like what are the unique problems to this sector? How can we move those critical pieces and elements so that it is still enforceable? We still have all these pieces and the workers are being represented. And so I think unions can be a part of that. I did also quickly want to answer the piece of, companies saying this is too much. I don't know. I mean, I have been privy to negotiations at the table with companies who will always say it's too much. However, right, if it was the EU coming down and saying, here's an human rights due diligence, they have no choice. And so I would say to companies, it is not too much. It is a system that will work long-term, that might take a year or two to really, get there and stabilize the supply chain and really start working for everyone. But I think there is enough research out there that proves that the model works if we trust it and start it and involve the right people. And that last piece of, the company committing financially to this. They commit financially to everything. I mean, Wilbur, you know this. They commit financially to a lot of things. But I think this is committing them to enforcing their market power and not working with suppliers at all, right? It's not just decertification. It's we're not working with you until you fix this. But yeah, I don't know what's going on in the chat or if there are other people that want to chime in or ask a question.
Thanks, Rafaela. There's a very interesting point being made by Ryan Heyman about the Dindigul agreement. I don't know, Ryan, if you would like to say something a bit more about that and about the similarities and differences.
Sure. Yeah, so I think for context, we've been working with worker-driven social responsibility programs for over a decade now, since originally funding the implementation of the Fair Food Program. I just got off the phone actually earlier this week with Ananya at Asia Floor-Ridge Alliance, looking at the differences in kind of similarities between the Dindigul Agreement focused on gender-based violence and harassment in India, as well as the Lesotho Agreement, also based on gender-based violence and harassment. One of the things we really look at actually is the pros and cons of enforceable brand agreements versus collective bargaining agreements, since enforceable brand agreements, of course, involve that direct relationship with the brand, whereas collective bargaining agreements typically only involve direct relationship with suppliers. But what we're actually finding is that although enforceable brand agreements typically always relate to a very narrow set of demands around something like wages or something like building safety or around gender-based violence and harassment, but increasingly they're a pathway actually to support unionization. So an example of Dindigul and Lesotho, some of the major parties signing on from the labor side are actually either women's rights NGOs or unions themselves, women-led unions. But in the case of Dindigul, as Asia Floor-Ridge Alliance is looking to replicate or expand the model, what they're finding actually is that it's actually becoming a means for them to start negotiations around unionization within certain factory contexts, within specific lines of production. So I have these conversations a lot with Worker Rights Consortium that essentially brands and employers are completely willing to be seen as anti-union, as anti-worker. They're completely willing to put their foot down around things like wages and severance theft. What they're not willing to be seen as is anti-women or supporters of things like rape or murder happening within their supply chains. So I think there's been this idea that enforceable brand agreements and unions don't necessarily mix, but in our experience, actually, we're seeing unions be really paramount to the implementation of enforceable brand agreements. And I think one of the challenges we're actually finding as a donor is that without unions involved, with union member dues, for example, that the scalability of enforceable brand agreement models, of worker-driven social responsibility models, is fairly limited. Even in the Lesotho program, there was actually a funding shortfall this past year of the enforcer. So we're really trying to figure out how do you have unions be at the center of an enforceable brand agreement model, because for it to scale and sustain itself, there needs to be that worker buy-in as well as worker dues that are really part of that enforcement mechanism. So happy to speak more about this, but just really curious to hear how other people are experiencing and analyzing these models.
Thank you, Brian. That's really helpful. I see from your signature that you're with Humanity United. Anybody else have a question or comment?
Maybe this is Megan. I put in the chat, and Rafaela and I are also talking, but you know, for the group or Rafaela, I mean, one of the things that I think was talked about here was there is a real opportunity that has gone on with dairy because of the third-party milk producers in the middle that I think made the model transparently, also politically attractive to a variety of actors that weren't just the workers, which of course I think the workers should be at the center, but the collapsing dairy industry in the United States, you know, one that received a very large supplement and assistance from the federal government and continues to do so. And so I think it would be curious to think about if there were other sectors where there is both the workers and another third party, which would benefit from the larger employer sector sort of lifting it all together. Because I think seeing it as an ecosystem where this kind of program supports all the actors, the supply, you know, along the chain, I think would make it more transparently, financially, and politically viable and sustainable. So, you know, just food for thought for others. I know we're coming up at the end of the time, but if there are other sectors where we can sort of see those connections.
Thank you, Megan. We have actually the webinar's running for another half an hour, so we have
great.
plenty of time.
Okay, even more. I thought it was to 12, but if others have ideas on that, you know, like, so like I said, yeah, I mean, the dairy example is great. So if there's other ones where people see an opportunity, I'm obviously a little biased to the US, but yeah, I'd be curious thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks, Megan. And I know there's a few people on the call still who work within the tea industry. I wonder if any of you have any reflections on whether and how you think this might apply in the tea sector. I won't be mean and pick on anybody, but okay. So maybe yeah. So, oh, Guy, did you want to say something?
The telltale sign when I turned my video on, you think I
Yeah.
was going to say something.
Yes.
Yeah, I actually was. But I think it's a really fascinating topic and really very, very important topic. And thank you so much for sharing this firsthand. It's amazing to, all jump on a Zoom call like this and get sort of subject matter expertise from the from the ground level in such a clear way. It was really very exciting. I have a couple of thoughts, and one is I think it's very, very applicable in the tea industry,
Would you
particularly on
like
large
to
scale.
introduce yourself, Guy?
Sorry, yeah, my
Yeah.
name is Guy Chambers. I have a bit of a background in tea. So I was the managing director of Finley's for 7 years, and Finley's had a number of large-scale tea estates in various places, including in Sri Lanka and Kenya. But they've since been sold by Finley's. I'm now working on a couple of projects, also quite closely involved in some of those large-scale tea estates. And particularly looking at operating models to try and bring them into the 21st century. But the question I've been thinking about listening to the presentation is, I mean, it is very, very applicable, and bringing kind of inverting the model of large scale tea estates. So you do have a situation where the colonial model of exploiting employees is completely reversed, but you're bringing into the 21st century is very much needed in lots of places, and we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. But one question though is, like with any change project or anything of the scale that we're talking about, the trick is, how do you get started? And there was a bit of sort of touching on this earlier in the presentation, and clearly ground level is starting on a large scale tea estate somewhere. But I'm interested to hear from the subject matter experts as to what, can you share a little bit of insight on how the programs got started, or how were they replicated successfully? And specifically, what is the cluster of people that works well as a kind of first group? So, for example, on a tea estate in Kenya, you may have 6,000 workers. So you can't just sort of wave a wand and suddenly do this for 6,000 people. But doing it in a small group of, let's say, 20 or 30, it may be too small to be meaningful. So where's the kind of balancing point from experience to say, okay, this size of a cluster is a good working unit to get the thing off the ground, and then to scale it from that? But what's that working first unit? Is it 30, 40, 50, 100? I have no sense of that, and I'd be really, really interested if there's any kind of tips or tricks that you've developed.
You go, Rafaela.
Yeah. Or do you want to say something, Alysha?
No, you go, and then I have a thought afterwards.
Good question, Guy. I think scale is important, and obviously starting with something where you're like fine-tuning the systems and being like, okay, this is working. Oh, we really need to adjust this piece, etc., is a good way to think about it. I would say the examples out there vary a lot. So I think what's important to think about is, when you said like a large tea estate, I was actually thinking maybe a small tea estate, like maybe something where it's much easier to trace that supply chain and much easier to say, I know that there's 50 workers here. The critical piece is having that end buyer legally signing, right? Saying, I'm going to commit this estate, these 50 workers, let's try this. The other critical piece is having the workers on the ground, an organizing body of workers that want to be deeply involved in designing and creating this. So maybe it's like the 6,000 worker tea estate, they're way more organized. They've thought about this. They've advocated before. Maybe that's a better place to start. I think the scale of monitoring, whether you're monitoring 6,000 workers or 10, is doable. There's been examples of that as the start of a WSR program. I think what's more important is getting a company who's willing to legally commit to doing this, and getting a worker organization or multiple, like Ryan said, it could be 3 or 4 groups who are like, yes, we know these different communities that all are involved in this industry, and having them be deeply involved in the design of this work. And again, just to say that the work of the network and of myself and of CIW and et cetera is to work with those organizations and say, okay, you're new to this. Let me give you all the tools of the trade that we've learned for doing this 10 years ago or 5 years ago, and how we adapted it, right? And you know, what I got to experience was adapting the Fair Food Program auditing protocols to dairy, because I was the first auditor to do it, right? So it's like, okay, working with the workers, et cetera, how are we gonna not monitor, you know, tomato fields, but dairy farms, and in a much smaller scale, right? We're talking dairy farms in Vermont have 2 workers, 1 worker, 20 workers within each farm, right? That is very different than a California dairy that has 100 workers. Is it scalable? Absolutely. And then we're talking about, you know, factories, clothing factories that have thousands of workers, and they've done it there too. So it really, I would say critical pieces is having that enforcement power. Because if you don't have that way to enforce, and for companies to really say, we will commit to pulling that premium, to not working with that supplier, it's really hard. And having the buy-in from workers is also critical. And then the flexibility, I think it's a deeper conversation of really digging into that tea estate and saying, okay, Rafaela, here are 2 examples, right? Here's one of a much bigger estate. Here's a smaller one. What do you think would be the barriers to both of those, and how would it work or not work?
Yeah, I think Rafaela covered absolutely everything. But I think, yeah, the one thing that, you know, I've heard from, you know, when I'm always asking questions about all the expansions, and like, you know, I know the history of the development of the Fair Food Program so well, and, you know, the way they expand is different because as the Fair Food Program was developing, they were boycotting brands, right? Brands were signing on, and brands are still signing on, but as they were developing. But when they do expansions, the brand has to be there first. They have to have the brand, and then, like Rafaela said, some sort of worker organization or organizations that are engaged and eager and want. And it doesn't have to be like, it doesn't have to be that they're really well organized already and have all this stuff. They just have to have some sort of structure and be, you know, wanting to learn, because the CIW, they're amazing. They're genius organizers. They're so great. And like what happens with so many of the expansions is like Milk with Dignity, they came down to Makali, they shadowed, they learned from Lesotho, the same. They came down, they learned from the CIW. They're so wise and also really good at sharing the knowledge that they've gained from their experiences doing this. So if there is a worker organization or several that are, you know, wanting to implement this, wanting to learn, and like, you know, I think smaller, but like sometimes they're huge, right? I think the point is like, if you have the power from that brand agreement established, and then you have worker organizations that want to learn, I think it can go, you know?
Thank you. That's super useful. Thank you.
Thanks, Alysha. Will, but just before I come back to you, I just wanted to say just some thoughts that have been crossing my mind while we've been speaking. And Alysha, you mentioned Pembala Oromai in Kerala, and I think that is an example of where there was a group of workers, like thousands of them, who were were trying to drive social responsibility, who stood up, who protested, who stopped work, who made their views known, and they were effectively squashed. I mean, although Pumbla Uramai now has formed formally into a trade union, it has like 240 members, and their management feels that they don't speak to them because they're not one of the major trade unions that, as you mentioned, Wilbert, has a lot of political power. So I think within the wider tea industry and that, colonial structure, it's very difficult for workers in the plantation context to actually by themselves break out. And if people like us on this call are going to be doing it or helping them do it, then is that worker driven is a question. But another question that I had is about when we talk about workers, obviously in the tea sector there's a large and growing number of smallholder farmers supplying the tea industry, and I just wondered if there's a context in which this model can be applied to farmers in terms of getting decent prices for their produce rather than wages. Wilbert, over to you.
No, well, maybe you want to hear from both presenters first on your questions, Shavita.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Wilbert. Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Rafaela, Alysha?
I think on the piece around, the price that farmers get and whether a program like this would work for them. Yes, I mean, I think the program addresses that via the premium, right? I think so. To get into the detail of it, right? Like the Milk with Dignity premium that is given to farms, which I explain is to offset the cost of compliance. And so you're saying, well, that's going to wages or that's going to improving housing, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea is twofold. One, if a farmer is able to come into compliance, they will, as the years progress, be able to keep more of that money. It's not just that, it's not like once you're in compliance, you stop getting that money. It's like once you're in compliance, you keep that money because you're part of this program. And yes, it's to offset compliance, but as time goes on, you will hopefully use less of that money to comply with the code because you're setting up systems, things are working. The other piece I was going to say is, what was I going to say? Offset compliance, keep that money. Yeah, I mean, I think it is about farmers organizing and recognizing that they are the price pressure is coming down on them, right? And advocating to the companies, like this program would not only benefit the people I employ, but myself, and advocate, right? Like come together with those worker organizations and say, here's what would work for me. Like I need to get paid X amount per pound of tea. And then this is how then that would offset the cost of coming into compliance. And again, I don't know much about tea, but like would love to dig into it. But that's how it's worked with farmers in dairy.
And then I can respond to your other question, Shivita, about, women, like the way that the CIW was able to protest is not a reality for many of the workers other places. And I think like this is one of the reasons why the buyers have to sign on before the expansion takes place. You're not doing the protests to get the brands to sign on because it's not safe for workers to do that there. It is still certainly worker driven because the workers are still the ones there setting the standards. They're involved in all the processes in the same way. They're just not out on the streets protesting like they did in Florida because they don't have to, because the brands sign on before the fact, I think is the response to that one.
Thanks, Alysha. And just to emphasize, when I talk about farmers, I'm talking about small scale, smallholder farmers. So then we have Wilbert, and then Catherine, you had your hand up, although it's gone down again now. I don't know if you still wanted to speak. Wilbert, over to you.
Yeah, this discussion. I really appreciated the fact that you've built so much time into this session for discussion, Shavita. Thank you so much. Also allows me to develop my thoughts as the conversation progresses, and try to imagine opportunities to make this work in the tea sector. And I think that tea production has become well, and making caveat with Guy on the call here. I know I'm in the company of somebody that really knows the sector, where I've been an outsider looking in. But so, Guy, please jump on any sort of statements that I make when you think it's really beside the point or really not relevant. I think that the tea production and like the tea coming from particular areas with big tea sectors, where there's been a history and a pattern and of documented labor abuses and really bad labor conditions, has become an increasing problem for big retailers in Europe that now will have to comply with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that has been or will soon be enacted by the European Union. And so they will probably also determine that the remedy and the prevention that they hope to get out of certification schemes is not always there, because certification schemes are often also at a loss of how do you deal with endemic issues that are much larger than the footprint that you can create. So I would think that there is an interest, like an active interest, and also, like, say, a business interest for big retail that sources tea from places in India and elsewhere in Southern Asia, to engage with this model and see if that can provide an alternative to previous approaches. And so that's where the conversation could start, I would say. And on the other hand, the producers that have been certified, that always have always also found often that the certification standards are too much of a straitjacket and are problematic for different reasons. So perhaps they are looking also to alternative approaches. If you compare that with actually an engagement with worker organizations, for instance, in India, which I don't think has been really done that well in the past by NGOs and labor rights organizations and certification schemes, like a good trade union relations program. I don't know of any, basically, that was rolled out by any of those organizations in India or Sri Lanka. And I think it is needed to build a dialogue and a discussion with a legitimate or at least established and legal worker organizations about this approach. And maybe that can build basically the conditions under which this is possible. So I am hopeful that this could be tried out in the tea sector, but only for a lack of expert knowledge, probably. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Wilbert. And perhaps you and I could talk about that further and see how we could engage with some of those big buyers to propose this model and where it might be applicable and feasible. Catherine, did you want to come in?
Yes.
Hi.
Thank you. That was so inspiring. And but my question would also be, being coming from a rather small company compared to the big brands that are out there in tea, would it be something feasible for us as well? Because how big do you have to be? How much money do you need to invest in order to say, I will be the company who steps in and who says, I take this up and I want to take this forward? I wonder, because a lot of the programs are just designed for large corporations and not for small independent company like ours. Whereas I would feel we have the advantage of hearing the green leaves grow on the tea bush, because we are just focusing on Darjeeling and 2 Assam tea gardens. And yes, I would like to have an idea of, if we would want to start, where would we need to start? Because I'm also think we don't want to be caught between the rock and a hard place when we do something that unions might feel is their territory, or the management might feel we interfere too much. I mean, our intent is to do something for the workers. So how would we need to go about it?
Thanks, Catherine. Do you want to just quickly say a little? Yeah, would you like to say a little bit more about your company, just by way of introduction?
Okay, sorry, I just mentioned I work for Tea Campaign. We are in the market since 1985, and our idea is to source directly and to sell directly. So we cut out the middlemen and can purchase at a high price without making our tea very expensive, because we save cost in everything else. So that is in short our idea.
Thanks, Catherine.
Yeah, Catherine, a really great question. It's a complicated one. My quick initial thoughts are evaluating whether your market footprint, or like your purchasing power, is strong enough where the folks you source from are gonna like boycott you, right? Like, we do not need if they can say, we don't need to sell our tea to you, like, we can go to someone else, because we're not going to want to be in this program that makes us do more things, right? Like, very, very closed-minded way of analyzing, but it's an initial thought. Then that's where you need to think about it. Who are the suppliers or the employers or the estates who will walk alongside with you and say, okay, this is a little scary, but you pay me a price premium. You are kind of walking alongside with me in order for me to implement this, I'll do it. If the employers or the suppliers come together like they did in Florida at the beginning and say, we're going to boycott this as employers, we're not going to say yes to this, then yes, you have a problem, you have an issue. Now, the additional piece that you need to think about is, at the end of the day, you're telling the employer, do this with me, but you're also saying, but there will be consequences if you don't do it right? Like, yes, I will source tea from you and I will pay you a premium to be in the, WSRT program. But if the auditors work with you and there is sexual harassment, and if you don't do the right thing, we will stop sourcing from you. It's a big ask, but that is the ask, right? Because if you cannot say there will be consequences for you not following those corrective action plans, that complaint resolution, then the model falls apart.
I also have one other thing to add. Your question made me think of, I'm going to put it in the chat now. In the Fair Food Program, they have something called the Fair Food Program Sponsor for small, because the model is based on market power. It has to be a big deal if you withdraw, right? If it doesn't really matter if you withdraw, it kind of takes the power away. But the Fair Food Program was getting all these requests from smaller businesses and co-ops that wanted to be a part of the program. And so they started this thing called the Sponsor Program that allows smaller businesses to be a part of it. And to be a sponsor, you pay a little bit annual support payment that goes to the workers and to the monitoring body, and then they do the education of their customers about the Fair Food Program to kind of expand the model. And it's, I don't know, kind of a nice way for these smaller businesses that might not have that market power, where if they withdraw, if they do those consequences, the suppliers will say, okay, whatever, like, you know, you're not one of our big buyers, but still still create a way for those smaller businesses, those co-ops, to be a part of the program, which I think is a really cool addition they made to the program.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Catherine, for the
Thank you.
question.
But
Yeah, sorry.
if I may add, that gives me hope, because we are in long-term business relations with our suppliers, and we still have others asking us if we want to buy their tea because they know we pay good prices. So I think we could find a way to collaborate with our producers, because after all, we all sit in the same boat. We either swim together or we sink together.
Yeah, and I would say, Catherine, you know, for Ben & Jerry's already had like a lot of direct relationships with the farms in Vermont. It wanted to support small dairy farms. It wanted to keep that model. It had a lot of, you know, environmental and animal rights that they had implemented before Milk with Dignity. And so for them, it was like, we don't want to lose the farms that we want to work with. It's not that they, you know, then the program asked them to go and source from big dairy farms, but it was just walking alongside. And I was part of a lot of education of those employers or suppliers of like, this is not a gotcha program. We're not trying to be like, what are you violating? Okay, let's kick you out. No, it's like, okay, here's the code. Let's figure out, you have time between now and when I'm going to audit to get there. It is still going to be a strict audit. We're still going to talk to all the workers. You're still going to have to say, if in 2 months you're going to raise wages, I'm going to come back in 2 months and make sure that that's happening. But there was, you know, an onboarding process of these small farmers, these small farms that were really scared of like, how am I going to do this? So yeah, I just wanted to leave you with that, Catherine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks so much. Thanks, Alysha and Rafaela, and to everybody who's taken part, especially people who've they've probably gone now, but I noticed there were people from India and South Africa, you know, for whom it's very late at night. So I think, you know, for me, this seems like the start of a conversation. And what I'd love to do, just to remind people that Rafaela has put in the chat how we can keep in touch with her. So with her and colleagues at the Worker-Driven Social Responsibility Network. And I would definitely like to stay in touch, Rafaela, and perhaps we can, you know, keep in touch along with Alysha to sort of continue working on this idea of how could worker-driven social responsibility become a reality within the tea sector. Great. So thank you very much. Do you want to say any final words, Alysha, Rafaela?
I just want to say thank you, and you know, like, would love to learn. I know very little about the tea sector, but I know a lot about implementing and expansion and figuring out how it works in different industries. And so I think collaborating with people who are interested in changing industries and bringing in that like human rights perspective, I'm happy to collaborate and have conversations.
Okay, we'll make the perfect team in that case, along with everybody else on this call. Great. So thank you very much, everyone. Thanks so much, Alysha, for bringing this idea to us. And let's, yeah, like I say, hopefully this is the beginning of the conversation, not the end. Great. Thanks very much, everyone. I'll let you go. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.